Well, today we welcome Dr. Terence Sibiya, Senior Executive on Africa at Nedbank, and welcome to you for having given us this guest lecture at our winter school, where your theme was See Africa Differently. And I think perhaps at this moment of time, it's a very significant time because there are 5 converging reasons that have put Africa right at the top of the global agenda. Firstly, there's of course the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine war and its fallout. There's the issue of BRICS, which is coming up shortly. There's the issue of the African Free Trade Agreement, which is in its 4th year. There's the issue of AGOA back on the US agenda and South Africa's agenda. And of course, there is climate change. So I think it was very timely that we had you here today to canvass why you believe that we should see Africa differently. And perhaps you would, in a nutshell, sum up your motivation, your message to the MBA students today as to why we must see Africa differently.
Thanks, Prof, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this winter school for the MBA students. I would have not have passed up this opportunity for anything else because ultimately, not only are we in Africa, South Africa, but to the opportunities that I see on the continent on a daily basis. Those 5 elements that you've referred to only exacerbate the need for Africa to play and take up its rightful place in the global League of Nations, not just for trade, but in the global geopolitics as well. We have an enormous opportunity on the continent, not only endowed by our natural resources, but also our human resources and the capability that each economy in its unique self presents overall, whether it is for lithium and battery manufacturing, whether it is for minerals that are required in steel manufacturing. We have it all on the continent. And it's time to look at what we've done and take stock to this point and what we can do differently to take full advantage of these global geopolitics that are presenting Africa as a massive growth potential.
What would you say? You know, we've heard about the African Renaissance. We have said a lot of positive things and negative things about Africa, but I sense that we've crossed a threshold here, a positive threshold. What would you say was the biggest single factor that enables you and I to talk so much more positively about Africa now?
I think the biggest single factor would be the overall political stability. The number of coups d'etats and the number of political insurgencies has reduced significantly across the continent. That begins to allow institutions to be stabilized, checks and balances to be put in place around how elections are run in many countries, and invariably that stability allows for foreign direct investment and also domestic investment to occur in these economies. So that's one big single factor.
And if we could add to that, I mean, if we unpacking, as you rightly say, the political economy of Africa, the changing landscape of the political economy of South Africa, of Africa at least. And you did emphasize, though, although I spoke about South Africa now, that we must always recall that South Africa is a part of Africa. Africa as a continent is not something that's just beyond our borders. We are an integral part of the future of the continent. But if we were to look beyond the politics and ask ourselves, what are the engines, the new engines of growth on the African continent that would be of interest to analysts and to business?
Beautiful question. And you will recall that I also mentioned this one single key factor of the demographic dividend. Looking across the many parts of the continent, which now has a 1.4 billion population, what I didn't mention was that of that population, almost 60% of it is under the age of 25. This is a growth population. This is a population where the middle class is growing. This is a population that has relatively solid financial literacy, digital literacy, and therefore is able to build entrepreneurial businesses and build skills where they are needed the most. There's also no shortage of capital, Prof. The banking systems across the continent, just in South Africa alone, are deep. And so the deployment of capital to where it is, to where it's most needed, will also be critical in building small, medium, and large corporations across the continent. So it's a massive growth opportunity if you just look at the demographic dividend alone.
And if you were to look at the continental scenario, as well as the Southern African scenario, where would you think, if you took a snapshot picture and ventured a very broad opinion, do the opportunities lie more with trade or with investment, or equally with both? Where would you put the emphasis at the moment between the opportunities for trade and the opportunities for investment on the continent of Africa?
Prof, it's my considered belief that the more we increase intra-African trade, the more foreign direct investment will follow. Because where we are right now, it is not going as well as we could amongst each other. And that's really what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is trying to solve for. If we can get aspects of that, I mentioned the small statistics of the population, for instance, of 250 million in just SADC alone. There's 14 countries in SADC, and the intra-SADC trade in and within itself is low. We are trading and exporting, but mostly outside of that economic zone. So if we can just figure out, for instance, the different regulatory instruments that can enable intra-SADC and access to this 250 million population, that in itself will see some of the smaller countries, including South Africa, much more enhanced and much more growth potential, including a direct impact on GDP growth.
I'm glad that you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because I sometimes think that is not getting enough prominence, enough momentum. Because as you rightly say, the sequence is first trade and then investment. That's the ideal sequence. And the more we can reduce the intra-African trade obstacles, the more we can look forward to the intra-Africa investment expanding. Now, what would you think in that context might be the biggest challenges that you face in terms of both expanding intra-African trade and then also, in the meantime, nonetheless, encouraging intra-African investment?
The single biggest challenge, if I can select one for the purposes of this chat, is energy and the stability of energy. Across the continent, we still have close to 500 million people which don't have a connection to any electrical supply or steady electrical supply. Now, it can be difficult under any circumstances with the insecurity of energy to build any economy. So we've got an enormous opportunity right now. I suppose renewable energies present an enormous opportunity for us to begin to address that. Invariably, that will also help our overall climate journey to a zero carbon economy, zero carbon economies across the continent. But if we can just single out one, the energy supply, we're experiencing that here in South Africa, how encumbering it can be to build and invest in any industry without the security of energy.
And that's important from a digital point of view. That future is hampered if you can't put the lights on and off.
Absolutely. Nor can you charge your phone or renew
exactly.
or renew its connectivity if there's no constant supply of energy. So just singling out one, that would be one key component of what can what we can build on to stabilize a potential economic boom on the African continent.
Now, if I could paraphrase you, I think you said towards the end of your address to the Winter School, we mustn't leave the future of Africa purely to the politicians and the bureaucrats. So I may be paraphrasing you, but you always said that, which for me is a very important emphasis, because it's saying to the business community, look, it's the politicians and the bureaucrats can draft trade agreements and sign memorandums of understanding and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's business and the markets that have to give content to that framework. Now, what is it that business people must do? What must they look for? And you did suggest some tips to the business community, what to look out for, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, but how to navigate it. And I wondered if you could just mention a couple of the most important ones.
Certainly. So I think for any businessman, any business person, looking to do business anywhere, the one single factor that they look for is certainty, or certainty in policy, certainty in regulation, certainty in business, in the business climate. So where the politicians become important is the provision of that conducive environment for us to invest. Therefore, it becomes important for us as business, as you say, private sector, to collaborate with the public sector, in the main politicians, to give us that certainty so that every dollar, every rand, every pula, or every shilling that we invest has some certainty of yielding a return for the investor. That's all we're asking for. So through the many different bodies in South Africa, we have Business Unity South Africa, Business for South Africa, and across the continent there are many of them that lobby the public sector to provide that certainty. As that stabilizes, investment begins to flow. So that's one big tip. The business community or the private sector community has to work with public sector to provide certainty.
But if I may add, there's a reciprocal that a government and its bureaucrats must be consulting with business, because it's business that have to make these frameworks work and to give them, to put flesh on them. So I think it's a reciprocal partnership to make a success of the new opportunities in Africa.
Absolutely. They must consult with business in and within themselves. Business isolated or politics or politicians isolated will never be able to solve the socioeconomic challenges around the continent unless they work together collaboratively.
Now, I think one final point with you is that you ended up with a very important message to the audience at the Winter School, taking all the political and the economic factors into account about the future of the continent, South Africa's role in it, Southern Africa's role in it. What was your bottom line as you looked into the crystal ball about Africa?
As I looked into the crystal ball and in my conclusion, it was apparent to me that the opportunity is there. The challenges might exist, but let's look at them as opportunities. Let's look at things differently. Digital or technology provides an angle for us to approach particular complex issues differently now, whether it's cloud computing or the power of artificial intelligence. How can we harness that to solve some of the basic societal challenges we see across the continent and exit more Africans out of poverty? Those are the key things for me that will be required from a business perspective, working collaboratively with the public sector and the political and the geopolitical dynamics that we see right now to solve some of Africa's most complex challenges, which present massive opportunities.
Thank you very much for that input. Indeed, I think, Terence, you're not only a successful business person, but I think you're also a supreme economic diplomat for us in the rest of Africa. So thank you very much for your contribution to the Winter School.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's a pleasure.